Have you ever wondered why the idea of hell has such a hold on us? This terrifying, fiery pit where souls are supposedly tormented forever. But here's the shocking truth. The concept of hell, as most people understand it today, was likely created and molded by the church. Yes, the church took ancient ideas, intensified them, and crafted an entire doctrine of eternal punishment. Why? Let's dig in. In the original teachings of Jesus, there's no evidence that hell was this torturous realm of endless suffering. Look at his actual words. He talks about Gehenna, a real place outside Jerusalem, where garbage was burned. It was a physical location, not a mystical underworld. So why was Gehenna used as a warning? Because in Jesus' time, it was a brutal reminder of what happens when people turn away from compassion and righteousness. But this place wasn't described as a realm where souls were damned forever. No mention of fire and pitchforks, or demons torturing the wicked for eternity. Those images came much, much later. In the ancient Jewish tradition, the concept of an eternal hell doesn't exist. Instead, you have ideas like Sheol, a shadowy realm where everyone, good and bad, just exists in a state of rest or sleep. There's no torture, no punishment, no fiery pits. It's just stillness. Even Hades in Greek mythology wasn't a place of eternal torment for everyone. In fact, it had different levels. Some were dark and grim, but others were more like resting places. So how did we go from this neutral idea of an underworld to hell as a horrifying torture chamber? Here's the kicker. It was a tool. The church, particularly from the 3rd century onward, realized the powerful grip that fear could have on people. By creating a hell of fire, anguish, and eternal punishment, the church could control the masses. Imagine the impact of a priest standing before a crowd, saying, "Disobey us, and you're risking an eternity in hell." Fear like that sticks. It digs into the mind. It makes people obey. And once that fear is instilled, it's hard to shake. Think about how much this shaped society. Hell wasn't just a spiritual threat, it was psychological leverage. By the Middle Ages, hell was fully weaponized. Paintings, sermons, literature, everything was tailored to paint this horrendous image of hell that would haunt people. And let's be clear, this wasn't about faith. This was about power. The church's teachings on hell are almost completely missing from the earliest texts of the Bible. Early Christian communities focused on love, forgiveness, and the concept of a merciful God. But by manipulating the fear of eternal damnation, the church gained incredible influence. You control people's beliefs, you control their lives. Let's start with Gehenna. In the time of Jesus, Gehenna wasn't some supernatural underworld. It was a real location right outside Jerusalem, known as the Valley of Hinnom. And it wasn't a place of punishment for the dead. It was a trash dump, a site where waste was burned. You can imagine the stench, the smoke rising, a constant fire devouring what people discarded. That's the imagery Jesus invoked when he spoke of Gehenna, a place where things were destroyed, not tortured forever. It was a powerful metaphor, a way of warning people about moral decay, about ending up thrown out if they rejected compassion and justice. But an eternal torture pit? Not at all. Then there's Sheol. This is the underworld of the Hebrew Bible, but it's not hell. In the Hebrew scriptures, Sheol is described as a shadowy place where everyone goes after death, the good, the bad, everyone. It's like a state of rest, almost a void, without joy or pain. No fire, no suffering, no torment, just silence and stillness. And that's what the ancient Jewish people believed. Sheol wasn't a threat, it was simply a destination, a final stop in a life well or poorly lived. It wasn't about punishment, it was about inevitability. Now enter Hades, the Greek underworld, which influenced later Christian ideas. Hades was a place where the souls of the dead went, but it wasn't necessarily a place of suffering. It was more like a divided kingdom with different realms for different kinds of souls. Some areas were dark, yes, but others were more like resting places. And in Greek culture, Hades wasn't even seen as a bad place. It was simply where the dead resided. But when Christianity spread, these ideas, Gehenna, Sheol, Hades, started blending together. Over time, as the church's power grew, it took these concepts and amplified them, creating the hell we know today. By linking Gehenna's burning fires, Hades' otherworldly mystery, and Sheol's association with the unknown afterlife, the church constructed a place of horror to enforce its doctrines. These original ideas weren't about torture. They were about consequences, rest, or simply a journey beyond this life. When we talk about hell as a place of eternal suffering, we're actually talking about a concept shaped by philosophers, not by the teachings of Jesus, not by the Hebrew scriptures. It was early church thinkers, like Tertullian and Augustine, who really started to cement this vision of hell as eternal torment. They weren't just theologians, they were influencers, the ones setting the spiritual agenda for generations to come. Tertullian, one of the church's earliest and most influential writers, was a big fan of the idea that punishment was eternal. He saw hell not just as a place for the wicked, but almost as a stage, a theater of suffering. Tertullian went as far as to claim that the righteous would actually get to witness the damned's suffering in hell. Imagine the psychological impact of that. He promoted this idea that eternal punishment wasn't just a divine necessity, it was something the saved would relish watching. This wasn't about justice, it was about creating a disturbing image that struck deep fear and obedience. Then we have Augustine of Hippo, one of the most celebrated philosophers in Christian history. Augustine's ideas on sin, guilt, and punishment would end up dominating Western Christianity. He's the one who crystallized the notion of hell as a punishment without end. No possibility of parole. No hope for redemption. For Augustine, the very existence of hell was proof of God's justice, a way of balancing the scales for every act of sin, no matter how small or large. And he wasn't pulling these ideas out of thin air. Augustine was heavily influenced by Greek philosophy, especially the works of Plato. He adapted ideas about the soul, justice, and punishment from the Greeks and embedded them into Christian doctrine. The twist? None of this came from the words of Jesus or the teachings of early Judaism. It was a philosophical project, a human endeavor to make sense of divine justice by any means necessary. Augustine was fighting theological battles, trying to make Christianity the dominant moral authority in an empire that was crumbling under its own weight. Hell as eternal torture was a convenient doctrine. It helped solidify his position, and in turn, the church's influence over the masses. If you could scare people with the idea that every misstep would be paid for with endless suffering, you had absolute leverage. Now, let's get to the real crux of it. Why did the church push this terrifying image of hell so hard? To understand that, we need to look at the historical context. In medieval Europe, the church wasn't just a religious institution. It was the most powerful organization in society, holding influence over kings, nations, and the entire social order. And what better way to keep people in line than with the constant threat of hellfire? For centuries, literacy rates were low, and the majority of the population didn't have direct access to the scriptures. They relied entirely on what the church told them. Priests, bishops, popes, they held all the cards. They alone decided what the people knew about God, heaven, hell, and everything in between. And with this knowledge, they crafted sermons and doctrines that emphasized hell as a place of unimaginable suffering. Not just as a consequence of evil deeds, but as a punishment for even the smallest deviations from church teachings. The church effectively turned hell into a weapon, a psychological tool that made people afraid to question authority. If you were told from birth that disobedience meant eternal fire, would you risk it? Of course not. The church knew this, and they used it to secure obedience, loyalty, and crucially, financial support. People were so terrified of hell that they would do almost anything to avoid it. They would follow the rules, attend mass, pay indulgences, sums of money given to the church that were said to reduce one's time in purgatory, or in some cases, erase sins entirely. It was like a spiritual insurance policy. Pay now, avoid the flames later. Indulgences became a massive moneymaker for the church. You could pay for the souls of your dead relatives, supposedly rescuing them from hell or shortening their time in purgatory. People would spend huge sums of money because they believed their loved ones were suffering in torment. The church capitalized on this fear, becoming not only a religious authority, but an economic powerhouse. And it wasn't just about money, it was about power. With hell in their arsenal, the church could crush dissent. Any challenge to their authority, any questioning of their practices, could be painted as sinful, heretical, and punishable by eternal damnation. The concept of hell allowed the church to enforce social order without needing armies or police. The threat of hell was enough to keep people submissive, to prevent revolts, and to ensure that the social hierarchy remained intact. The peasants stayed peasants, the nobility stayed noble, and the church stayed on top. Hell as we imagine it today, fiery pits, demons with pitchforks, a hierarchy of suffering, didn't just come from church doctrine. A major player in shaping this horrifying vision was Dante Alighieri and his epic work, The Divine Comedy. Written in the early 14th century, this poem was never meant to be a doctrine. It was a work of literature. But the impact it had on how people imagined hell, unmatched. In the Inferno, Dante describes hell as a layered realm of suffering, with each circle reserved for a specific sin and a specific type of punishment. The concept of hell as a structured, organized place with customized torments was something the world had never seen before. Dante's vision took the abstract idea of hell and made it terrifyingly tangible. He transformed it into a place you could picture in your mind, a dark journey that felt real. The graphic punishments Dante described were horrific yet compelling. Lustful souls blown about by violent winds, murderers submerged in boiling blood, and traitors encased in ice at the very bottom, each punishment tailored to fit the crime. Dante painted a hell that was deeply imaginative and disturbingly specific. The kicker? Dante didn't intend for this to be a literal description of hell. His work was an allegory, filled with political commentary on the corruption of his time. But once the Divine Comedy gained popularity, people started interpreting it as fact. Priests, artists, even common folks began to see Dante's hell as the real hell. And since the church had already cultivated the idea of hell as a place of punishment, Dante's work served to fill in the details, providing imagery that resonated and lingered. The timing couldn't have been better or worse, depending on how you look at it. Renaissance Europe was a place of high superstition, low literacy, and a religious structure that held enormous sway over daily life. Most people didn't read the Bible themselves. They relied on what the church, and increasingly, the culture around them told them. And here was Dante's vision, detailed, unforgettable, and terrifying. It didn't take long before his poetic vision of hell became practically indistinguishable from church teachings on the afterlife. And then came the art. The Renaissance saw an explosion in religious art, and hell was a favorite subject. Artists like Hieronymus Bosch and Michelangelo picked up where Dante left off, creating scenes of hell so vivid that people could practically smell the sulfur. Bosch's grotesque visions of hell, filled with strange creatures and nightmarish landscapes, were the stuff of legends. You couldn't look at his paintings and not feel the weight of judgment, the horror of eternal suffering. The church didn't create these images, but they were more than happy to endorse them. Why? Because this kind of art reinforced their message: follow the rules or face the consequences. Michelangelo's Last Judgment, painted on the altar wall of the Sistine Chapel, is another example. Here was hell, vividly rendered in the heart of the church itself, a constant reminder to anyone who entered of the fate that awaited those who strayed. Michelangelo's depiction of the damned writhing and falling, with the archangel Michael judging them, was an image so powerful that it echoed across Europe. It became a definitive symbol of hell, reinforcing the terror and the power the church held over its followers. This wasn't some hidden image in a dusty corner. It was displayed in one of the holiest sites in Christendom, where popes, priests, and pilgrims could all see it. And this cultural reinforcement didn't end with Dante or Renaissance artists. The Divine Comedy was published and reprinted for centuries. By the time the printing press arrived, Dante's work was one of the first major texts to be widely distributed. Now, this vision of hell spread faster than ever, becoming the standard interpretation, even among people who had never read the poem. Soon, Dante's Inferno and the visions of hell it inspired were practically inseparable from the Church's teachings. The Church didn't object to any of this. In fact, they supported it. They saw how these depictions of hell served their agenda. It wasn't just about terrifying people into submission. It was about creating a visual and literary narrative that locked hell into people's minds. Because if you could picture hell in excruciating detail, if you could see it in paintings and read about it in poetry, it became real on a level that sermons alone could never achieve. Let's dig into the Bible itself. What does it actually say about hell? The truth might surprise you, because the Bible's original languages don't offer the fiery, torment narrative that's been hammered into popular belief. In fact, if you look closely, there's a real lack of evidence for eternal torture. First off, Sheol appears frequently in the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament. Sheol isn't described as a place of suffering. It's essentially the land of the dead, a shadowy, neutral place where souls reside, awaiting the final judgment. In the book of Job, for instance, Sheol is simply where Job expects to go after death, a kind of resting place. There's no mention of punishment or eternal flames. It's a state of being after life, almost like a holding area for the soul. Then we have Hades, the term that comes up in the Greek translation of the Old Testament and in the New Testament. Hades, much like Sheol, is just the realm of the dead. It's not a place of active suffering. The Gospel of Luke mentions Hades when Jesus tells the parable of Lazarus and the rich man. The rich man suffers in Hades, but it's more of a temporary state, a narrative device, rather than a theological statement on eternal torment. In fact, Hades is often seen as a place where souls reside until the final judgment, after which they're either granted eternal life or face the second death. This second death concept is crucial. The book of Revelation talks about a final judgment where the wicked are cast into the lake of fire. This isn't described as hell in the conventional sense. Rather, it's seen as the final destruction of the soul, annihilation, not torture. In other words, the wicked are destroyed rather than tormented for eternity. So instead of eternal suffering, we see imagery of total obliteration. Theologians call this conditional immortality, the belief that only the saved are granted eternal life, while the rest simply cease to exist. This idea stands in stark contrast to the hell that's been depicted by art, literature, and centuries of church doctrine. Then there's Gehenna. We touched on this before, but let's clarify. Gehenna, a real valley outside Jerusalem, was a place associated with death and destruction, but it was not a pit of endless suffering. Jesus used Gehenna as a symbol, warning his followers about the consequences of a wasted life. When he spoke of Gehenna, he was tapping into the imagery of garbage being burned and destroyed there, not souls suffering forever. The idea was more about finality, the end of a life without purpose, cast into oblivion, not tortured endlessly. The cultural context matters here. For his audience, Gehenna represented loss and waste, not a supernatural torture chamber. And then we get to the fire. Jesus does speak of unquenchable fire in passages like the Gospel of Mark. But look closer. These fires were often symbolic. Fire in the Bible frequently represents purification or judgment, not torture. In passages from the Old Testament, fire was used as a symbol for God's cleansing presence, purifying rather than punishing. The New Testament carries this symbolism too. Fire burns away what's impure. In other words, the imagery of fire isn't always about torment, It's often about purging and refining. Another term that's key here is kolasis. In Greek, kolasis means correction or pruning. It's the word Jesus used when describing the punishment for the wicked. It implies discipline or reform, not endless torment. This concept suggests a purifying experience, a way to correct one's path rather than a sentence of suffering. This ekolasis approach views God's judgment as a way of refining the soul, rather than casting it into perpetual agony. The early Christian movement didn't preach hellfire. They preached resurrection and redemption. Look at Paul's letters. His focus is always on salvation, not damnation. Paul doesn't describe a place of torture for the unsaved. His writings emphasize the resurrection, the promise of eternal life for believers. This emphasis on life, on transformation and renewal, contrasts sharply with the hellfire sermons that came later. So where did it all change? When the church grew into a powerful institution, the focus shifted. Leaders saw the potential of hell as a control mechanism and began emphasizing it. Writings and interpretations that leaned toward fear and punishment took over, while more compassionate views were buried. Some early Christian writers like Origen actually argued for universal reconciliation, the belief that all souls would ultimately be reconciled with God. Origen's ideas weren't popular with church authorities, who saw more utility in a hell that could scare people into compliance. Here we are, after diving into all these layers of history, philosophy, literature, and art. One big question remains: why are there so many versions of hell? What does it mean for believers when we realize hell, as we know it, is the product of centuries of shifting ideas, cultural influences, and human decisions? First, let's think about how this range of interpretations came about. Hell wasn't originally a monolithic concept. The different words and images used in ancient scriptures didn't point to one single, agreed-upon place of torment. Sheol, Gehenna, Hades, all of these were reflections of different cultural ideas about the afterlife, not a cohesive place of eternal suffering. When Christianity spread through the Roman Empire, it encountered numerous beliefs, from the Greek underworld to the Egyptian concept of judgment in the afterlife. Early theologians, faced with questions about justice and the soul's fate, began weaving these ideas into their teachings. They took elements from the surrounding cultures and built them into the doctrine. And let's not forget about the influence of fear as a tool. As Christianity gained power, particularly from the 3rd century onward, it became a state-backed religion with real political clout. Leaders saw hell's potential to keep people in line, to ensure obedience, and to prevent dissent. It wasn't enough to simply encourage people to live righteously. Hell provided a powerful stick to complement the promise of heaven. By promoting hell as an unending horror show, the church gained leverage. The idea of eternal punishment became institutionalized, a hard line that was easier to enforce and to preach. This journey didn't just stop at doctrine. Over the centuries, hell seeped into Western culture, taking root in the minds of artists, writers, and philosophers. Dante's Inferno, Michelangelo's Last Judgment, Bosch's nightmarish landscapes, all of these became visual anchors for hell. The art and literature of hell took on a life of its own, creating something far more terrifying and concrete than the Bible ever described. By the Renaissance, hell was not just a spiritual warning, but a vividly imagined realm of horror, full of demons and grotesque punishments. For believers who have grown up with a strict, almost unquestioned belief in hell as eternal punishment, these revelations can be unsettling. It raises questions about other doctrines we take for granted and challenges us to think critically about our faith. If hell isn't exactly what we thought, then what is our faith built upon? What is the nature of God, if not a God who would consign people to unending suffering? This doesn't mean that faith itself is a fabrication. Not at all. What it does mean is that our understanding of faith and of God might be deeper and more complex than we've been led to believe. The version of hell that's been drilled into us for centuries isn't necessarily the original view. It was shaped by cultural biases, political motives, and human interpretations. And maybe that opens up a different way of understanding what it means to be judged, forgiven, and redeemed. For some, this can be a freeing realization. The God of compassion and mercy described by Jesus feels a lot more in line with the idea of a loving creator than the hellfire sermons that followed. And when we strip back the layers, we find a faith that's not based on fear, but on love, grace, and transformation. In a way, discovering the evolution of hell gives us an opportunity to reconnect with the teachings of Jesus, which emphasized love, forgiveness, and redemption far more than they emphasized punishment. It reminds us that faith can be about seeking truth, not about love, even if that means questioning long-held beliefs. We don't have to fear hell to live ethically, to seek justice, or to find meaning in our spiritual journey. In closing, I hope this deep dive into the history and evolution of hell has given you something to think about. Maybe it's opened up new questions or sparked a different perspective on faith and what it means to believe. Thank you for watching, for being open-minded, and for exploring this topic with me all the way to the end.